rec management initiatives for more effective access to information. This is another one of our series of webinars is part of the SERI initiative, which is part of the Council State Archivist Programming, and it was developed by the Education Subcommittee with support from the Laura Bush 21st Century Librarian Program Grant from IMLS. So we're very pleased to have with us today two speakers who you most likely saw at SAA, either in passing or in a session or two. Our first speaker, Meg Phillips, is NARA's External Affairs Liaison, and although her role as a liaison is how many of us know her, Meg actually started with NARA back in 2002, during which time she has held several positions and worn many hats. Previous to her current position, she served as the Electronic Records Lifecycle Coordinator in the Office of the Chief Operating Officer. In her role, Meg was involved with two very large-scale electronic records initiatives, which we are familiar with, both NARA's Electronic Records Archive ERA project, and then the search for automated electronic records managed solutions under the Managing Government Records Directive, which she will be discussing here today. And our second speaker, Don Schlant, will take us through the most recent iteration of NARA's format guidance for the transfer of permanent electronic records. This is being implemented at the federal level. As a member of NARA's electronic records format team, responsible for researching and writing guidance that's directed at federal agencies and focused on permanent electronic records, including the recently released revised transfer guidance. And joining NARA, Don worked with the State Archives in Virginia and South Carolina. With that, I am going to turn it over to you, Meg.
Hey, everybody. We'll see if I have presenting rights, and I do. Wonderful. I advanced the slide, however.
May I try clicking with your cursor in the slide window and then using your arrows?
The project was made possible by a grant from IMLS. And just so you can picture us, here is me, Meg, and Don, who will be talking to you today. So I'm going to give you a disclaimer, first and foremost, that what you're about to hear from both me and Don is a distilled down version of a presentation given at SAA. So this was the title slide of the SAA presentation, Establishing a Foundation for Access, ARMA, NARA, and ISO frameworks for improving information management. So I was one of three panelists, along with my colleague Don Rosen, who's the director of the policy staff for the National Archives, and Diane Carlisle of ARMA International. Three of us were working together on this presentation, and I am expert in part of it, but I'm not expert in all of it. So I'm compressing just a little bit on some of the topics that we covered. So our focus today is on directives, standards, governance models, and good use of technology, because we believe that good access to archival information is not the result of good luck. It's actually the result of careful planning and program building, with the goal of access in mind from the very beginning. And this is especially important in the current environment where we're dealing with mostly electronic information for created records. The systems that you put in place now for your program and the processes and technology you encourage in your organizations, in the creating organizations, can make all the difference in how easy or hard it is eventually to provide access to that information to the people who need or have the right to use it. So for this session, I'm going to try to give you a quick recap of some of the most exciting and useful developments from the National Archives, but also from the information management profession as represented by ARMA, that can help you think about establishing a foundation for access in your programs. So we're going to be talking about the Managing Government Records Directive, which is big news at the National Archives, our work, both NARA's and ARMA's work, the standards for records management, and I'm going to go over that pretty quickly. And then I'm going to talk about some of the work going on in ARMA, because I think it's important for everybody to know what's happening in that kind of profession to those of us who consider ourselves archivists. So we're going to go over the principles and the information governance maturity model coming out of ARMA. And we'll talk at the end about technology and automation and how those things can also help support the foundation you're building for good access. The Mission Government Records Directive was the result of a presidential memorandum, as I imagine most of you know, that directed us at the National Archives to transform records management for the federal government for the 21st century. So it was a modest goal there. Set two very high-level goals for federal agencies, for the entire federal government. We're going to manage all permanent electronic records electronically by the end of the decade, and more immediately, we're going to be managing all email, both permanent and temporary, electronically by the end of 2016. That has set out a series of actions for NARA and agencies to work on together over several years. So a couple of years and for the next few years, we've really been focusing on the implementation of the NARA tasks that help move everybody towards this goal of a 21st century framework for management with the ultimate goal of access in mind. So I'm going to go over this very quickly as well, and we can back up and take questions about this at the end if you like. But we're thinking about our activities under the directive under the broad rubrics of people, process, and technology, or policy and technology. So on the people side, we have been focused on developing communities of interest, so peers in federal agencies and at NARA who can work together and help pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, working together on topics of mutual interest. So really strengthening our peer-to-peer ability to share and learn from each other. We've been working with the Office of Personnel Management to establish a job series for records management. That is not quite finished yet. We've had quite a bit of back and forth with OPM to make sure that our vision of how its records management can be is reflected in the OPM job series. So we're still having that conversation and watching that space. We require that agencies all establish agency officials to provide high-level accountability and program ownership for records management in their agencies. And we've also set some training requirements and training goals in the people category. In the policy and process category, this is actually where most of you are probably paying the most attention. We've got new transfer format guidance that Don will be talking about later. We've got the capstone email guidance. We just released in draft some minimum metadata requirements for the transfer of permanent electronic records to the National Archives. And we've issued a social media bulletin as well. A lot of activity going on in the policy or process side. And then on the technology side, we've been working on a report and plan for the increased adoption of automated tools to support electronic records management. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more in its own segment at the end of this presentation. So one theme that spans all three areas there, the people, process, and technology, is NARA's belief that the use of standards is a real critical building block to developing a good, solid records management program. So we're going to talk a little bit about the work we've done with ARMA to develop records management standards. So I bet all of you are using standards every day, so I don't think we need to go over what a standard is exactly, but ISO's own definition is that it's a document that provides requirements, specifications, guidelines, or characteristics that can be used consistently to ensure that materials, products, processes, and services are fit for their purpose. So we tend to think of that in terms of a thing that can help assure quality, safety, efficiency. It can help lower costs, and it can ensure interoperability of systems that are developed in different places. So there are lots and lots of benefits to using standards. ISO itself is the International Organization for Standardization. Just so you know how this all hooks together, the archives and other American organizations participate through NISO, which is the National Information Standards Organization, and through ANSI, the American National Standards Organization. So that's our pathway to the International Organization for Standardization. So ISO was established in 1947. It's got 163 member countries. It's pulling together a ton of expertise and a real diversity of opinion and experience from across the country. They've published 19,000 standards in every industry, and one of the industries they're touching is archives and records management. We have standards development processes that are really well structured, and ISO is nothing if not well structured. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but if somebody proposes the need for a new standard, it goes to a technical committee that has jurisdiction over that area, and then there are a bunch of different steps where experts are pulled together who have something to contribute on that topic. They hash it out until they've got something that they've got consensus on, then they bring it to the technical committee, see if they can get consensus on it, then they bring it to the ISO as a whole, see if ISO can get consensus on it. So it's a very consensus-driven participatory process. And from that point of view, that we're actually doing this work, in addition to the National Archives and ARMA, are lots of other national archives. So Library and Archives Canada, a bunch of European national archives are on these committees working with us to establish these standards. And also professional associations like AIM and the American Library Association, in addition to ARMA, vendors and consultants, sometimes software companies will get involved. And working together in the context of a technical committee. So in the context of records management, we are talking about Technical Committee 46, which is Information and Documentation. Subcommittee 11, Archives and Records Management. So we have a very specific home, ISO, to talk about these kinds of issues. I just learned this, and I think it's kind of cool. ISO numbers its subcommittees order as they're formed. So it's not like Library of Congress subject matter or anything like that, or classifications. There's nothing to the numbers except that was the order in which they were created. So just to give you a sense, ISO was founded in 1947, and Technical Committee number 1 is dedicated to screw threads. We are Technical Committee 46, dedicated to information and documentation, and they're currently up to Technical Committee number 292. So we were in the first good, core of the technical committees created. And a quick review of the records management standards that ISO has been involved in is 15489, which is, broadly speaking, records management programs. Standards related to metadata, implementing guidelines for disposition of records, management of programs, trusted digital repositories, and a separate technical committee actually for document management applications. Technical Committee 171 has been working on the standard for PDFA. So everything is not perfectly centralized in the Archives and Records Management Technical Committee. So NARA and ARMA really feel like standards, participation in the standards development process, and use of the standards that result in developing our own local guidance and to the extent that we can, is really a strengthener. It's a good, solid building block that we can use and we can point to when we're explaining how we came to do what we did, that we're participating in international standards development, and then we're using the products of that standards development process to make sure that what we're doing is in line with what the broad information management community thinks is appropriate. Okay, so I'm making a little transition between our standards discussion and the portion of this presentation that was designed by Diane Carlisle at ARMA. And the goal of this segment is really to make sure that people in and federal archives and records management programs understand what's going on in ARMA as a professional organization, because it's really interesting and it's potentially very useful to those of us in government or those of us who have some records management responsibility. So the first slide in the ARMA segment is actually a graphic of the Information Governance Reference Model. And we're using this to make the point that ARMA, which started out as the records management organization, very rarely uses the language of records management anymore. They think about information governance. And that's a really powerful phrase, and it's a powerful concept that I think we all benefit from thinking and talking about a lot. The idea behind information governance is it represents a unified, holistic view of all the different stakeholders who are engaged in managing information as the lifeblood of a modern organization. So it really emphasizes that in order to be effective, information governance has to be interdisciplinary. It has to include the business owners, the people in charge of privacy, the people in charge of security, IT, records information management, and legal. All those people have to be working together to create a governance structure for the information of the organization. And it has to be really collaborative. No single perspective drives the decision making, but everyone has to be bringing their perspective to the table and working together to develop an organization-wide view of how they're going to, again, govern their information. So I think this is really powerful language. And I also kind of like this graphic because if you read it carefully, you'll notice that the gray circles separate the bands are also labeled. So the outer band is unified governance. All of those stakeholders are together working as kind of a governance board for information management issues. And you aim for policy integration and process transparency as you cross all those different domains. The other interesting thing about this graphic is that it actually comes from the e-discovery reference model. So this graphic is embedded in the legal profession, and that's really where it came from. ARMA was involved in developing it along with the e-discovery reference model people. And information governance, it shows as the first critical step in discovery, the process of producing electronically stored information for litigation. So I think that's just a useful thing for you to have in your back pocket as you're designing and talking about your information and records programs. The thing I want to talk about is the ARMA Principles. I go over this very quickly, but if you go to ARMA's website, you can see a lot more detail about all of these products. But again, I think it's a very strong business-oriented summary of why you want to do information governance and what the goals of information governance are. So ARMA has identified generally accepted record-keeping principles. You might have heard these discussed as GARP. It seems to me that they have gone away from using the phrase GARP. I think that term might be used by something else. And now they just refer to it as the principles or the ARMA principles. So the principles are accountability, transparency, integrity, protection, compliance, availability, retention, and disposition. So you see the records management stuff in there, but they're not using the same language they used to use. And I'm sure this is obvious, but a tip card is just the mnemonic device to remember all of those principles. The principles are the basis of ARMA's information governance maturity model. So the model, like other maturity models, lays out different steps that you progress through from a minimally program or an unacceptable program to a really strong transformational program. In this case, red is substandard, orange is in development. You're making some early steps. And amber, 3, is essential. And in this maturity model, there's a bright line at 3. So 3 is the minimum acceptable level. And the full maturity model describes what the program looks like at each of these levels. Once you've got the minimally acceptable program at level 3 on each of those principles, A2 principles, building towards ever more powerful implementations of your information governance model. And I really love the idea that the top level is transformational, where you're not merely doing a good job of managing your records and information, but you're unlocking the value of that information, are able to leverage it to do things that you could not do before, that you're managing it so well that it's become a true asset to your organization and is allowing you to make leaps into different kinds of activities or different insights than you were able to have before. So just quickly, we'll highlight the principle of availability because we've been stressing access throughout. This particular principle says its goal that an organization shall maintain records in a manner that ensures timely, efficient, and accurate retrieval of needed information. It specifies what it's like if you meet that goal, and so talks about how to get there. So what this particular principle depends on are things like finding aids, metadata, structure capture processes, and as much automation as possible, which we're going to talk about more later. That is basically the summary of the ARMA products that we think is really essential for people in the grid space and the archive space to know about. Now we're making another transition to the last segment of my presentation, which is technology and automation. And here we're going back and linking back up to the very beginning where we talked about the Managing Government Records Directive. One of the many activities that was identified in the directive that NARA had to do over the after the directive was issued was goal A3, investigate and stimulate applied research and automated technologies to reduce the burden of records management responsibilities on the end user. So the words on the end user aren't actually in the directive, but we stick them in anyway because we want to be extra clear that what we're trying to do is put the responsibility and the authority for records management decision-making in the hands of the experts. So people running the information governance program, the archives program, the records program, are responsible for designing systems that make sure that the right things happen to records in an automated way, and we're not relying on the million separate potential points of failure of every single employee doing the right thing with every electronic record. So that's really the vision that's laid out in the Managing Government Records Directive. And in the archives and records field, we talk a lot about the challenges of technology and the challenges of managing electronic records. But this is a case where we really want to focus on the opportunities. Yes, there are certainly difficulties in managing and preserving electronic records over the long term, but technology to manage this information is also getting better. And we're on the brink of being able to do some incredibly exciting things with it. So modern technology and modern kinds of automation, including auto-categorization tools and other kinds of things, are giving us the potential to actually automate policy implementation. All those standards we just talked about, all those governance processes that we talked about, we can actually build those into rules in our technology and get a level of compliance and a level of consistency and ultimately better access to more information than we've been able to do in a really, really long time, probably since there were central file rooms and trained and file clerks responsible for all those records. So we may be able to do better even than we were able to do then. The other interesting thing about technology is that in order for these tools to really be done right, to be done in their most powerful way, they're done centrally, enterprise-wide, as a true information governance project, so that they're jointly owned by all those stakeholder groups. So implementing one of these modern automation systems gives the opportunity to really what you're preaching on the information governance front and make a single investment that benefits all those disciplines and gives you the opportunity, really the responsibility of breaking down the information silos and working together because you just have to. 3 in the Managing Government Records Directive supports the short-term goals of the directive that we've already talked about, managing all email electronically by 2016 and all permanent electronic records electronically by 2019. We at NARA have also chosen to use A3 as a lever to open up a big visionary conversation about the direction of records management in general. Ask questions about how do we want this to work? How could we do this better? How can we use technology to build a world where anyone who has the right to use information can easily find and use that information? That's the world we're trying to build towards. So we want to support the transition to effective government, but we really also want to support NARA's own organizing goal of making access happen. So a year ago, we kicked off a year-long series of activities with an article in Archival Outlook called Make Access Happen. This was the July-August issue of Archival Outlook, where we published the clearest description, the most detailed description I think we've come out with yet of why we think there's a problem with the way we're doing electronic record keeping now, and opening up the call to action and the call for a discussion about, how can we do this better? And now we've got a mainly electronic environment. We've got much better tools than we've ever had before. How do we development of new tools and implement the ones that we've got so that we actually start implementing something that works better and that's laying the groundwork for future access in a really solid way. So as a result of some of the input that we got in over the course of the year, part of that project, and some research of our own, including an industry day, a call for industry to tell us what they can currently do, a lot of work with federal agencies who are on new ground in automation. We issued a draft report and plan in March on electronic records management automation. We got a lot of feedback on the draft and have created a final version of the report and plan, which we are expecting to be released imminently. Now, I said that now that I have to laugh at myself, but really do still hope it's coming out like in the next week. It's kind of hot in our own bureaucratic chain right at the moment, but we are expecting to come out very, very soon. It is a better product than what we released for comment in March, but it outlines the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve with electronic records management automation, the risks of the different approaches to automation, NARA's stance on records management applications certified under the DoD 5015.2 standard. And to summarize, our stance is that they are not required. We do not believe that's the only effective way of managing electronic records. And for some types of electronic records, record management applications are not particularly effective. It outlines the approaches to automation that you see on the slide there. I'm not going to go into those in a lot of detail right now, but we are particularly interested in some experiments that we're seeing at agencies like the Department of Interior, which is doing it enterprise-wide, and Department of Energy, which is doing it within one unit, where they're using auto-categorization tools, essentially all email, and they're rolling it out to different record types like SharePoint sites and drives in stages, so that they are training their software to recognize records that belong in different record schedule categories. And they're developing new processes. They're using their information governance expertise and their experts to guide and train systems and keep them tuned so that they get the records that they want in the right categories. And extremely exciting. And for the volume of information that's now flowing through a lot of these organizations, a lot of your organizations too, we really believe that that's going to be the only way of getting truly consistent compliance with retention schedules and getting complete electronic records collections for the archives. Basically taking the decision-making out of the hands of the end users to the greatest extent possible. So, pay attention. We will be releasing the final report and plan on electronic records management automation through the Records Express blog, which is a channel for records management news at the National Archives. The report looks very much like what you saw before. It's better, tighter, makes more sense, but it's recognizably the same thing. The plan has changed more, and it proposes a number of steps that NARA is going to take and that NARA is going to propose in partnership with organizations to make those approaches to automation that we've discussed more accessible and more affordable to agencies. Because while we are seeing some agencies that are well-funded, well-organized, highly motivated implement these automation strategies, it's still not widespread. And we know it needs to be easier, more accessible, practical, run-of-the-mill records program to implement for this to really work. So, in summary, we, in this case being both NARA and ARMA, believe that a combination of information governance principles and maturity, measured by a maturity model, and if you're federal, the Managing Government Records Directive, or if you're not federal, as an example of an organization trying to become more mature on the governance model, looking at its people, process, and technology, plus standards and best practices, plus technology and automation to implement and execute all those standards and structures that you've identified, you can really build a foundation for access to electronic information in a very, very solid, useful way. So that's my presentation. Go straight into Dawn and take questions at the end.
That'll be fine.
Okay, thank you. Can you? Okay.
Can you please?
Okay. All right. As Sarah nicely introduced me, my name is Don Chalfa, and I'm a member of the NARA format team. And I'm going to take you through the revised transfer guidance that we released in February of this year. And this is NARA Bulletin 2014-04. Its official title is Revised Format Guidance for the Transfer of Permanent Electronic Records. So if I use the term transfer guidance or format guidance, rest assured I'm talking about the same guidance. I want to the members, Kevin Divorcey is our team lead, and Jill Hudson are also members of our team, and we're also working on metadata guidance that mentioned earlier. Also, before I get started, place ourselves in context of NARA as a large entity. We are agency services side of NARA, and specifically in the Office of the Chief Records Officer. So we are agency-facing, certainly responsible for writing about records management issues, guidance for agencies from NARA on records management. Also, this is where our appraisal department is. The appraisal archivist are there. In the States, I guess they're called records analysts. So that is that introduction there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the goals as we went in project, the scope of the project, and some of the major changes. So in this slide, you should get a slide that says former transfer guidance. And before, I also want to kind of go back in history a little bit and note that NARA has been accessing electronic records since the 1970s. And I'd say probably the first couple of decades or so, a lot of those records that were coming to us electronically were coming from mainframe computer systems. So I think you've seen probably in movies these large mainframe systems with reel-to-reel tape, and so 9-track tape. So that formats that were coming from those systems were very limited. We were talking something called FCDIC, a lot of FCDIC format, and ASCII character sets. So not a whole lot format-wise. Concern is more about physical media, how you transfer that over to the National Archives. But as everyone knows, in the 1990s there was an office automation revolution that the government and business certainly jumped aboard, and a lot of permanent records, a lot of records in general, and permanent records were being created in these new environments. So a lot of new formats were coming out. And there was a lot of opportunity, it seemed, for NARA to release some guidance on that, which they did in association with several other agencies between 2002 2004. There are 6 different bulletins that covered some formats. So basically these bulletins included one on email formats. There was a bulletin on digital photographic records. There was scanned images of text. There was an entire bulletin on PDF format. Bulletin on digital geospatial and web content records. So within these bulletins, there were around 50 or so formats that were covered, heavily weighted towards non-proprietary, or makes sense. And, in many ways, I think it was a lot of it ahead of its time. I mean, I don't know of any two archives that were talking about digital geospatial formats in 2002, 2004. So why revise it? I mean, that sounds pretty good. We have 15 formats. We have mostly non-proprietary. Well, we had a little bit of time between the time that it was revised and the time that this first format guidance came out and the time that it was revised. Accession some electronic records, and we back and we look to see exactly what kind of formats we were getting, how many, and it turned out that we were getting a few more, approximately 100 or so formats we had accessioned selections. So it did seem that about time to go back and readdress this issue. So in 2002, we started afresh with the transfer guidance to look at it again and see how we can improve it. Our guidance. First of all, we really wanted to develop something that was flexible and extensible, not we needed. And obviously, if the guidance that we had before came out in 2002 and 2004 and was never touched again for eight or so years, we wanted to try to address that. And we do that. I guess to not delay suspense here, what we did is when we issued the new bulletin, the new revised guidance, we issued it as a bulletin with an appendix. And the appendix has tables in it, and the tables contain all the formats. And the idea behind that is to take and be able to have the flexibility to add the formats as we need to the table without going through the entire bulletin process, which can be certainly a lengthy process. We wanted to balance a preference for open standards that was in the original transfer guidance with formats that businesses or the business needs of the agencies. So they did have a preference, not necessarily our preference for open formats, but they use formats that a lot of times were proprietary. Investigate, if it was possible to make those formats accessible. We wanted to expand the number of formats. The 15 or so that we had obviously weren't covering what we were seeing out there when it came time to accession them. And we also really wanted the need for agencies to transform these records prior to transfer. Under the old guidance, when we had 15 or so formats, they came to transfer them to us, then there would be a dilemma of, well, they don't meet our transfer guidance, things got to happen. The responsibility is this to get them into formats. And according to the old transfer guidance, it really meant the agencies were supposed to have them in the correct format. So the goals, and I think we have a good basis to build this on. Another thing I want to point out here, this is little the electronic records life cycle that Kevin put together, and the reason that it's here is really talking about the scope of what we were doing. We were very concerned about where transfers belong. The original transfer guidance between 2002 and 2004, that guidance talked a lot about creating quality records, and we still keep a little bit of that information, in quality files, I should say, just quality factors, what kind of proper kind of scanning should you do to what quality level. We did keep some of that, but we felt at the point of transfer, when agencies should be using transfer guidance, that might not be the best place to have that information. So there will be opportunity for us to a little bit more work about scanning operations and a little bit more information on the upfront of creating good quality file formats. The result was we took the original 6 bulletins and we created, as I said, one bulletin with 10 categories in it, so file format content categories. As you see on the screen, we have categories for digital still images, moving images, text, geospatial records. You might not have noticed, but what wasn't before in the original transfer guidance that was issued is there wasn't any format guidance on digital audio or digital video. We added that into this transfer guidance. So that we also expanded it to include computer-aided design or CAD records, as well as structured data. Increased the total number of formats from about 15 to 60, and that is 60 and not 16. 16 wouldn't be a whole lot increase, so 60 formats. And there are non-proprietary and proprietary formats. We identified formats within those categories that are preferred and acceptable, and another category acceptable for imminent transfer. And the idea behind this is that we really felt that if NARA was given the option of a record, that per record being transferred, that within two formats, that we would have an opinion on what we thought we preferred as to what was just generally acceptable. The acceptable for imminent transfer is really to sunset or deprecate certain formats that we think are no longer in use or that we don't want to keep transferring into the National Archives. And a good example of this is the geospatial category from the first transfer guidance bulletin on geospatial records. There's a format called SDTS, or Spatial Data Transfer Standard, and it was created by the FGDC. Unfortunately, it was about dead on arrival. There were other geospatial formats that supplanted it by the time it came out. And although you can find information about it, if you go to the website that exists today, it will tell you that there's it's only there for historical purposes. So the format's not been updated. Into folks at the USGS, they say they don't have any permanent records in SDTS. And the department themselves have said they've never received a permanent record in SDTS. So that format, although we do list it as acceptable for a transfer, that's a format that, as we revise this transfer guidance, we'll want to remove that out. We're doing a certain period of time here to let those formats exist, and as far as transfer format, and then take those out. Now, how to get to this point of these 60 or so formats? Well, outside of a giant dartboard with formatings on each dart and throwing them to the bullseye, and whoever hits the bullseye, that's when it gets in. We thought we ought to go a little bit different direction and use some sort of criteria. I really liked what the Library of Congress had done, and we weren't above stealing or borrowing that, and working closely with them, I might add. And they had done some work on 7 sustainability factors criteria. And just this is things like disclosure and adoption, so transparency, self-documentation, as you can see on screen. So disclosure would refer to how much information or specifications do we have on a format. Do we know what the format is supposed to look like, what the header information of a format is supposed to like. Widely adopted is the format. Under adoption, is it very narrowly adopted, or is it adopted globally? We took every format and we ran it through that criteria, and we came up with our 60. Is a mapping from the old to the new. And the main thing I want to point out here is what we did with the PDF. As I mentioned before, we had an entire bulletin on PDF format, and that might cause a problem. If you just say we accept PDF, you might accept PDF for every single file type, and that's not really true. In some instances, PDF is a great file format. It works great for text, which is what it's designed for. there are also good PDF format for geospatial records, presentations, we included it there, and digital still images such as scanning. We accept that. It is not a good format for digital audio, although that you can take an audio file and put it in the PDF. We don't want that transferred to us, not for digital moving images or structured data. The idea here is that PDF is now associated with the content category where it belongs, where we should receive records in PDF within the format category that is most appropriate. It covers what I just talked about. So we have them categorized by genre, and we also have rolled into different categories. And proprietary formats, so I'll briefly mention that. Why did we do that? Well, certain instances such as Microsoft Word and Excel, they released the specifications in 2010. It made it a little bit more viable for us to accept that. And also, it's widely adopted. There were other criteria that helped make its case. They would be acceptable formats and not preferred. And I'll just talk about what the transfer guidance is not. I've talked about what it was, what it is now, and what it is not. It's not a comprehensive list of formats for agencies to use for all business purposes. We know that agencies have business needs, and they will choose software and create records in certain kind of formats that may not meet the transfer guidance. But what we are saying, though, is that if it's a permanent record and you want to transfer that record, then you need to transfer that record to National Archives. It should be in our transfer guidance. The transfer guidance is not creating guidance, as I mentioned earlier. It doesn't tell you how to set up a good scanning operation for the transfer of permanent electronic records. It's not appraisal guidance. We do not appraise records based on format. We appraise records as we always appraise records based on the content, the information, the historical value. I'll sure know the criteria. And so, in this instance, we don't have guidance with this transfer guidance or format guidance on physical media. That National Archives does advise on that. There is a web page devoted to that, and also our custodial unit we felt was more than able to talk to the agencies at point of transfer about the type of physical media that should be transferred over to National Archive. I will stop there and just open the floor up to questions for either Meg or myself. Good stopping point.
Questions for either one of them? Go ahead and type it into the chat. Thank you much. This is good this time around.
I feel for you who heard it twice.
No, that's good. We need repetition to remember. Very quiet out there.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions? Like last time, as with the previous webinars, all the slides and audio recordings of the presentations will be available on the SERI Educational Webinars page in a few days, and we'll also have accompanying documents so you don't have to go hunt them down, although if you'd like to, you're more than welcome to. And the very least, as you sign out, you'll be receiving an email with a link to evaluate the session. If you could take the time to do that, we'd really appreciate it. Please go ahead. Wrap-up items. Our educational webinar is Tuesday, October 14th, and that's going to be all about the electronic records ingest topic. And you can always go out to our website and the webinar schedule, what's coming up, and slides from previous, and audio for most of them.
There's a question in Q&A from Mark.
Oh, yep. Don, that NARA is appraising based on content. Good. Then we need to start addressing migration rather than requiring specific formats.
That's a good question. Hi, Mark. I know Mark. Yeah, the idea, when we took this project on, we we entertained a lot of different ideas of, should we even narrow the formats down to anything? Should we just say we accept anything? And I think the answer was no. We wanted to make sure that we specified a certain number of formats or a certain type of format so that we could narrow the amount of resources it would take to manage those and to try to open it up in a way that made sense. I mean, when it comes to the migration end of it, yes, we do need to work on that, and NARA is working on that. We recently hired a digital preservation officer, and that's very much part of this whole process. So I think there'll be a lot of feedback between what goes on the preservation side of things. As I mentioned, we are on agency services. We work very closely with our custodial unit, and that'll be a conversation as we go back and forth as far as what kind of migration we have, and what formats are best suited towards permanent records collection. Is that Mr. Mark?
And hear from him, Marcella. Meg, you have a couple agencies that are experimenting with records management, auto-categorization, etc. Are they doing that on their own, or have they involved NARA in the research from the start? Has it been a partnership, collaborative effort?
I would hesitate to call it a partnership, actually. They have been keeping us informed, and particularly on the scheduling side, we have been very involved. I know with the Department of Interior, because they consolidated a bunch of fine-grained retention schedules from their individual bureaus into one department-wide retention schedule with much bigger buckets in it. And so NARA was very involved in the planning for the new retention schedule, but the planning for their own IT system was driven by their CIO's office. Seeing sort of similar trends going on in other organizations. So I think this is probably true in many states as well. Like NARA has a good relationship with the records officer in the federal agency, but we don't always have a very relationship with other parts of that agency. So where we've seen this really take off, there's been a very strong central momentum with an executive sponsor pretty high up in that agency, where they're trying to solve a problem in information governance within their own agency. And it's, in my opinion, not an accident that the Department of Interior was the agency that had its internet connection shut down. I mean, they had real problems to solve, and the problems were getting in trouble and costing them money, and they were spending a lot on litigation support. And so their return on investment was very clear. Make this central investment to integrate their records and their e-discovery needs and their FOIA needs and everything with one integrated program. So I would love to say that NARA was in there designing that with them, but in actual fact, the agency leadership saw the need and took the initiative.
Are you going to move toward bigger buckets? I hear that more frequently now.
I would definitely say that that's a trend.
Yeah. Okay.
For things like auto-categorization, where you are using learning, train an algorithm to recognize records that belong in a particular category, if you have 2,100 retention categories, that's just going to take a long time and a lot of effort to keep tuned. So it's just kind of a practical cut.
Are questions out there?
Keep the chat.
Oh. Got it. Meg, the source of government functions seem necessary for auto-classification. Are there any readily developed and available and perhaps accessible?
I'm sort of hesitating. I answer to this question at the tip of my tongue. But there is Don, you have it at the tip of your tongue. There's a model for federal government functions that many agencies are indeed using. And one of the agencies actually in Interior has a very, very strong advocate for everybody doing their retention schedules according to the activity reference model. It's basically the enterprise architecture of this reference model, I think, is what they're using. And that is published. I think that is available. Maybe I can look it up when I actually pull it back. Yeah. I can send it out to you, but it's not something that has a tremendous amount of energy behind it right now, but there are definitely strong advocates, and I can see the logic to doing it, so that, a function, and I've heard people say that if one agency trains software to recognize records belong in a particular category, that pre-trained algorithm could be transferred within the same software to another agency that had records of the same type. So there could be the potential for a collaborative win if we could work together with defined categories that cut across agencies, but we are not there yet.
Okay. Done to add to that?
No, I think of the name of that document either.
We'll catch up with you on that later.
I'm frustrated with myself.
Kathleen, there was work done on government function vocabulary a long time ago as we were developing descriptive standards for state government archives. Ted from National Archives did some work on a federal version. Our work vetted in the art and architecture thesaurus, not exactly perhaps what is being sought, but perhaps a start. Questions? All right. It's crickets and it's 2 o'clock. All right, thank you everybody for attending. And as I said, you'll get a little there you go, evaluation when you leave. So please take the time to fill it out. And thank you both, Meg and Don, for coming and speaking with us today. We really appreciate it.
Inviting us.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a good afternoon.
You too. Thanks. Bye-bye.